Hello everybody, it's Professor Parish, and welcome to week 3 of English 122 in the summer. So we're getting very close to midterm, which is crazy, right? But we're not going to talk about midterms yet. We are only on week 3. So today, I'm recording this on Sunday, so this Sunday we are wrapping up week 2, which is the end of fiction and nonfiction and short story, and we are moving into new territory. We are moving into poetry for a very few scant weeks. And so I'm going to go here to weekly assignments. Yes, so make sure for week 2, though, you'll notice that there's only 2 assignments listed here. Make sure to drop down into week 2 and that you've done the discussion forum, that you've done the MLA review, the fiction exam, and especially turned in paper 1. Paper 1 is worth 100 points. It's a big assignment. Make sure you turn it in. And then the extra credit assignment, if you get time to do it, great. If you don't, it's just extra credit. But make sure you get these other assignments in first, because this is not enough points to take the place of any one of these assignments. So you don't want to be like, oh, I did the extra credit, I don't have to do my MLA review. The MLA review is worth more points than the extra credit, so just keep that in mind, all right? But we're going to look at week 3. So week 3, we're going to start our discussion of poetry. We have our discussion forum that is due. All of our posts are due Friday. Responses are due by Sunday. And I'll go ahead and click on the discussion forum here. In the discussion forum for this week, basically after you watch this lecture video, you can go in and basically choose a poem from the glossy pages in our book that start after page 698, and we'll talk about those when we get into the chapter. And then pick an image poem combination and use at least one term from chapters 13 or 14 to describe that image poem combination. And then you'll choose a second poem image combo and kind of do the same thing using metaphor or symbol. So, and then the final question is, which do you prefer? And explain your answer. So it's kind of a little compare and contrasting this week in the discussion forum, but my idea is that I want to see kind of what you choose and see how many of your classmates kind of pick the same combos, or maybe we all pick different. Who knows? But that's the discussion forum for this week. The MLA citation review Dropbox, basically this is just another checkup on MLA. I am going to be, in next week's video, going specifically over MLA. I'm going to be talking about that for week 4. So if you need refreshing on MLA, I would say look to the presentation that's in our syllabus handouts and videos section, and also you can get on my YouTube page and go back to spring semester and see the MLA video if you don't want to wait till next week. But basically what this is I am asking you, and you have your Cengage handbook as a resource too. So your Cengage handbook has that little kind of cardboard cutout that has examples in it. You can use it. It also shows you how to do MLA. I want you to write out the formula for MLA. So how do you write a print book citation? How do you do an article? How do you do a peer-reviewed journal? How do you do a YouTube video? How do you do an interview? If you look at that MLA presentation that is in our syllabus handouts and videos page, it shows you how to do all of these. So the answers are there. It's in the presentation. You just need to go look at it and then come back and do this assignment. Also in that presentation, it shows you how to do in-text citations. So what we have here is I give you an in-text citation. I want to know, I give you a source. I want to know what goes here for the in-text citation. Is it the author's name? Is it the website? Is it the page number? It depends on the type of source. And like I said, your MLA citation presentation, and I'll show you where that's at in just a moment, will give you the answers to these 5 questions. All right? But that's pretty much it for the review. You can go here. I'm going to click on the syllabus handouts and videos. You can go to this link, scroll down to week 1. The presentation's right here. It has all the answers in it. You just have to click on it and then download it and check it out as you're doing the assignment. And like I said, next week I will be doing a video explaining MLA. So you have the discussion forum, the MLA citation review, reading response number 2, which is going to be right here. For the second reading response, what I have is actually for you all to watch this video. I really like Lindsay Ellis. She is a internet, she creates online videos that I think actually work like essays. She does basically video essays, and they're not your standard typical boring video essays that you're like, oh, I have to sit here and listen to this. No, she actually does some really fun, creative pop culture videos that combine stuff that's very relevant and familiar to us, the audience, and examines it through a very critical lens. And so this first video is called Dear Stephanie Meyer. If you know who Stephanie Meyer is, you may already be like, what is this video about? If you don't know who Stephanie Meyer is, I'm not going to spoil it for you because she does a really good job with this video. It's about 15 minutes long. So just plan to watch that. And then when it's over, there are some questions here to answer. Okay, so this is Todd in the Shadows. He is a musician and scholar in music, and he also does basically pop song and rap song reviews on YouTube. So I have watched his stuff for several years. I really like him because he's very smart. He has a lot of intellectual discussions about music and about lyrics and about songwriting, but he also is really funny too. So he has a very sarcastic, dry sense of humor. His gimmick is that he's in the shadows all the time, so you can't really see him. But he actually grew up in West Virginia, and so even though he lives in New York now, he has a very strong connection to country music. He's not a big fan of new country music, so if you are a fan of new country, I'm sorry. But he reviews this song Cruise by Florida Georgia Line, specifically the Nelly remix. And so he talks very briefly here about why Nelly chose to be on this song in the remix, and it all comes back to this idea of meter and repetition. So just keep your ears open and listen as Todd explains kind of Nelly's his flow, his use of meter here.
Why did Nelly pick this song to guest on? Well, like I said, the subject matter fits, but also, have you ever listened to Nelly's flow, that sing-songy thing he does? Yeah, if you listen, it's just two notes, a fourth part, like this. Da 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 da. And Cruise? When I first saw that bikini top on her, she's popping right out of the South Georgia water. Da 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 da. Two notes, perfect for Nelly.
So yeah, that basically is the reasoning behind Nelly's flow in that song, rather. But I thought that was a fun example of someone modern to kind of look at for that. So yeah, you can go back and watch that whole video if you want, but I just like the idea that modern songwriters, they're still using these same basic poetry principles all the way down to uses of meter and iambic feet in their work. So these next couple slides are going to be about a few different terminology that we come across in this chapter. One are half and slant rhymes, and if you watch any Todd in the Shadows videos, like the one I've just showed you a clip from, he has this kind of bonus round in his videos where he talks about half rhymes or song lyrics that don't rhyme, and he's really frustrated by them. I think it's okay. Half rhyme and slant rhymes are pairs of words that don't necessarily rhyme, but they're close. They're similar enough. So on page 629, you can kind of see they give a definition, and then they use Gwendolyn Brooks's poem Truth as an example of this. So like she has, if you look at Brooks's poem Truth on there, then you can see shimmering and hammering. Shimmering and hammering don't rhyme, but they have that M-I-N-G sound to the end of them, like shimmering, hammering, that it's similar enough. It's a slant rhyme. It's close enough. You can count it almost. That's kind of what half rhyme and slant rhymes are. It's when you can't quite find that rhyme, but you're just going to use a word that sounds similar enough. And then we have free verse versus open form. These two terms often confuse a lot of students because they're so similar, but there is a distinct difference between them. Free verse, there are no rules. The poem barely resembles an actual piece of poetry other than its style. The fact that it's short, usually talks about something emotion-ridden, usually doesn't have a structure like a short story, but it doesn't look like a poem. Personally, I'm not a fan of free verse. I'm kind of more traditionalist. I like my poems to have a structure. I like them to have a rhyme scheme. I'm not a free verse person, but I know a lot of slam poets and people that do modern poetry that they're all about it. So whatever floats your boat, I guess. Open form is similar to free verse in that it does not have to rhyme. It does not have to have a pattern, but it still looks like a poem. It's still written in stanzas. It still has a poem set up, like in the stanzas, in the order. It just maybe doesn't rhyme. So that's the key difference. Free verse, no rules. Open form, there's still a form, but we don't really follow any of the other rules. And you will have that asked to you on your poetry exam, so just keep that in mind. How should we interact and read poetry? The big thing is that we need to give it a close reading. We talked in the fiction chapters about how it's often time-consuming and hard to read a piece of fiction a second time over. That is very true to poetry, but poetry is short enough where you can still give it a second look. You can still analyze it and sit down with it and go over all the fine details, right? Get your bearings with a poem, understand who the author is, understand the time period that's written in. Robert Frost poem, if you didn't know it was wrote in the early 1900s, you might be like, well, why are we talking about horses? Why is he on a horse riding through the woods? Is he in the country? If you don't have that historical context, it's just adding more layers to that poem. The more you know about the author, the more you know about the time period. Respond to the poem as a whole. Look at the entire poem and respond to it. Don't just look at one single line. Get into the spirit of the poem. If a poem is about something sad, understand that that's what it's about. If it's trying to get you to laugh or be sarcastic, just understand kind of what the author's intent is. And then be ready for a personal response. Poetry is designed to make you react to it, to make you have this visceral experience when you view it. So just be ready for that. All right. Vignettes versus haikus. This is on, let me get the right page on here. Page 643 talks about vignettes and haikus. I kind of laugh about this because I had a student that actually hated haikus to the point where when we got to starting to talk about poetry, he's like, I have nothing wrong against poetry, but I just hate haikus. I hope we don't talk about them. And I was sitting here like, well, you're going to have to do one for your exam. So, so on his exam, he actually wrote a haiku about hating haiku, and it was glorious. I love haikus, and I love vignettes because they are simplistic, they're short, but they have very strict constraints, and they force you to be creative and make creative choices. So a haiku is a 3-line poem. Each line has to have a certain number of syllables. The syllable requirements are 5 for the first line, 7 for the second, 5 for the third. So my little haiku here is, class is almost done. Can you hear spring calling now? Wish class was over. That's a haiku. As long as you meet that syllable requirement, it's a haiku. And it's harder than it looks. Trust me, if you're trying to make a nice, coherent haiku, it's harder than it seems. Vignettes, on the other hand, are what we call snapshot poetry. They are no more than 3 lines. They can be 1 line, they can be 2 lines, they can be 3, and there is no set rhyme syllable scheme at all. You can go crazy, go nuts, and be fine. And a lot of people like vignettes because you can kind of use that term we talked about in nonfiction and fiction, understatement, and you can say a lot of powerful emotions in one simplistic line. So I really like vignettes and haikus, but some students are like, ugh, I don't want to do it. So you will have to create one for your final exam and for your poetry exam, so have fun with that. I think you will. That one student, though, he cracks me up because he really did not like haikus. Chapter 13 talks about the whole poem and pattern. So we talk about context, which is a web of meanings, and I really like that terminology, the fact that it is kind of creating this rich texture within a poem. And poems often require a lot from their reader, and that's what can frustrate readers, is that they're like, I'm being asked to do so much with this little poem, and I just want to read it and enjoy it. And the poet's like, no, I have goals. Poets ask questions with their work, and they sometimes use the poems themselves to work out answers for the audience. They play off of opposites. They help us to draw maps and comparisons in our minds about places, things, emotions. They build off of contrasting points of view. A poem may start out with one perspective and end with another. And oftentimes, poems can even build to a high point, to a climax, much like a short story, but maybe it doesn't have a resolution. Maybe the resolution is one line only and that's it. There's just a lot of different things that poets can do with their work, much like authors can do with their works of fiction or nonfiction. So there's a lot of variety and a lot of options here. Concrete poetry is basically poetry just about physical, tangible things. Repetition is where we repeat a certain style or a word in a poem, and it's very similar to parallelism, which is when a poem starts and ends in a similar way. Very similar to the way we use parallelism with fiction and nonfiction. These two, I put these together because they kind of are the opposites of one another. A cumulative poem builds to a certain point, kind of like it does the little roller coaster thing where it builds to the climax. Counterpoint is where it just bounces from idea to idea like a pinball machine. It doesn't really build to anything, it's just comparing and contrasting different ideas. Antithesis, or antithesis, is where you take a certain theme and you build within the poem the opposite of it. So if your poem is about peace, if the message of your poem is about peace, maybe the poem itself is about how bad war is. You're kind of building to a point by describing the opposite of it. That's antithesis. And then if something is metaphysical, it's about emotions and being passionate and analyzing the intangible rather than just talking about stuff that is in reality. So it's the opposite of concrete poetry. All right. The reason why I told you that chapters 14 and 15 we were going to fly through, because there's no terminology in chapters 14 and 15. All we have is image and metaphor. And we know what a metaphor is because we've looked at it in our short story chapters. But on page 698, we start to look at these, and I really like these glossy pages of poem and image combinations. And your discussion forum is going to ask you to kind of choose between these poem and image combinations. And I would encourage you to, as you're deciding which poem and image to choose, I would read them aloud. I would read the one you're thinking about picking aloud and see if you still like it, or if maybe you want to choose a different one. With image and metaphor, it's important to be careful of cliches. You don't want to do something that's been overdone. Like poems about love often get cliche because you can only talk about certain aspects of love so many times. But then sometimes poets find unique ways to talk about love, whether it's through antithesis, where they talk about something horrible like a breakup and that's the representation of love, or maybe they find ways to like talk about love through a different perspective in the poem. You just have to try to find creative ways to address the themes of your poem in ways that aren't overdone. A controlling metaphor is very similar to an extended metaphor. It's when it kind of becomes a central theme of it, kind of like what we saw with a central symbol. In figurative language is when we're comparing to stuff that's not real. And then finally we have sonnets and conceits. Sonnets are specific 14-line poems. I know a lot of high school students have done sonnets while they were in high school. I'm sorry. Sonnets are hard. They're very long poems, and you have to do them a certain way to make them work. Conceits are elaborately developed poems that set up stories or analogies within them. So a lot of terminology here with poetry, as you've probably noticed by this point, but much like symbolism and style was with our nonfiction and fiction chapters, all of these terms are very subjective. Your poem does not have to have every single one of these terms. I like that our textbook gives us so many terms to go over because we can each apply certain ones to our own work and to the own poems that we read in different ways. And I really appreciate that. So that's this slideshow. And I have one more to show you all before we talk about the paper 2 guidelines. I'm going to hopefully not keep you all here forever. So chapter 16 talks about allegory. Allegory is a set of symbols that work together to create a pattern. Places, colors, names, seasons, you know, atmosphere, things like snow, rain, those can all create allegories within poems. And then the glossy pages, the second set of glossy pages on 762, kind of show poems that deal with allegory and different representations. I really love Edward Hopper's Nighthawk's painting, so I'm kind of partial to that poem, but there's some really good ones in this second section as well. Jackson Pollock's is good as well, as is The Great Figure. So check those out. Chapter 17, the web of language, and poetry very much situates itself within a web of language. Poets are sticklers for the right word. If you're doing a haiku or a vignette, each word has a definite weight and importance, and so poets have to know when to use the right words. They have a keen ear for emotional quality of words. What word is going to get me the most bang for my buck in terms of emotions when my reader goes over it? Poets understand differences in tones, which are the attitudes that words create, and they understand how to use language. So our textbook talks about in chapter 17 archaic language, which is language that is outdated. Our book has a ton of sonnets by Shakespeare in here, which is fun. I like Shakespeare's poetry as much as anyone, but you'll notice that there's a lot of text in here that is a bit archaic. Our book uses a lot of 1800s, early 1900s poetry, and some of the language and the phrasing is a bit archaic. It's a little outdated. Nobody's talking about selfies in any of these poems. It's not that modern. And so I'm going to try to bring in a little bit of modern poetry throughout some of these assignments, just to give you all a little taste of some modern stuff. But yeah, there's quite a bit of language in here that's a little outdated and archaic, and we'll just have to get over that. So these last three terms that are at the bottom of this slide are terms that we definitely see throughout poetry. The first is actually Dr. Rice when he was the speech coach at SIC. It was his favorite word, he told us, and that's onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia is when words sound like they're spelled, and I just love saying it's onomatopoeia. Onomatopoetic. That can be anything. Any type of action verb typically has an onomatopoeia sound. So like buzz and hiss and clap and stomp and slap. And yeah, it's just that word has that sound. Like slap sounds like the sound. Buzz, hiss, that sound, usually if it's an animal noise especially, has an onomatopoeia quality to it. Poetic diction is when words are very refined and elegant, more so than normal conversation. So a lot of Shakespeare's poetry uses poetic diction. It sounds very flourished and flowery and sophisticated, and that's why it's supposed to seem like it's above normal conversation. And then finally, circumlocution. This means a phrase takes the long way around in terms of its meaning. And I like circumlocution as a term because I think it can apply to more than just poetry. For example, I had a student in a class once. He was writing a resume for the class, and he put down on his resume that he was a Italian cuisine preparer and transport specialist. And I was like, man, that sounds pretty cool. I was like, where do you work at? And he's like, Domino's. He was a pizza delivery guy. And I actually really enjoyed that on his resume because it wasn't a lie. It was the truth. He was an Italian cuisine preparer and transport specialist. It was just a much cooler way of saying it than pizza delivery boy. So that's circumlocution. It's just a fancy way of saying a very simple, normal phrase or task. Dialects are on page 795. They show us where a poem could possibly take place. So I like this term because often we don't get a sense of the setting of a poem, and dialect is a way of telling where that poem takes place at. So you can look at Hugh MacDiarmid's poem Weep and Wail No More, and you can kind of see by looking at that poem that there's some archaic language here. We have stop killing the deed, Giar, you're weeping and wailing, Yaman keep quiet, if you want to hear them still, and no blur their image in your mind. For they've only a faint wee whispering voice, making nae mair noise ava than the growing of the grass that flourishes where nobody walks. My voice naturally, reading this poem like it is, wants to adopt a Scottish accent, because that is where this poem's written. So that dialect, that where, the way he says where instead of where nae walks, is just that the way he says it and the way he writes it is to get us to say it a certain way, to give it that accent, that dialect. So yeah, try to say this poem pronouncing the words as they're spelled there, and your voice will naturally want to adopt a Scottish Irish accent, which I think is really cool. But it's kind of a way for the poet to show us where poetry is written. And then alliteration, my favorite poetry term of all time. I love alliteration. It's repetition of the same sound at the beginning of several words in a similar line. So I was on the speech team here at SIC, and we do our little warm-up speeches, and we would do like the regular ones. We'd be like, she sells seashells by the seashore, or Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. That's alliteration. So she sells seashells by the seashore has that same similar sound. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. That has the same like peh, peh, peh sound to it. So if you're ever in a bind for creating titles for your papers, I highly recommend alliteration, because it's a really good technique. It's fun, it's creative, and it's instantly, it's an instant creative twist you can put on anything by giving it that same little similar sound. So it'd be like, alleys, alligators, abandon by the alleyway, or something like that. Like something that has that similar sound to it. It's fun. Chapter 18 talks about form, rhyme, meter, and stanza specifically. An end rhyme is normally what we see with poetry, and that is rhyming that's at the end of a verse. So your typical poem will have an end rhyme scheme, but not always. On page 811, for example, we get internal rhyming, where the rhyme is actually in the middle of the sentence, which is kind of cool and different. It reviews meter and stanza a little bit at the start of this chapter, and then this section here will be on your poetry exam, so please make note of it. Multiple rhymes are when more than 2 lines rhyme in a sentence, and I'm going to ask you on the exam to give me an example of a single rhyme, a double rhyme, and a triple rhyme. And here's your examples. Single rhymes are just single syllable rhyming words, like moon, soon. Double has 2 syllables, so balloon, saloon. Extrovert and introvert. Extrovert, introvert. Triple rhyme. So when you see that on the exam, that's what I'm wanting to see. All right. Similar to half and slant rhymes, there's assonance, which is when words have kind of a more echo sound that's similar. So our examples from the book are break and fade. We have that break, we have that ache sound, and fade is that aid sound. So it's that similar like high A, eh. And then we have mice and fight. So we have mice and fight. So that same like I sound. That is assonance. Anapest is 2 unstressed syllables and a foot. So instead of the to walk, it'd be like to walk. There's just no stress. And then we have trochaic versus iambic. Trochaic is when the stress is on the first syllable. Iambic is when it's on the second syllable. And our book in chapter 18 gives us some examples of how you can see trochaic on page 817 being used alongside anapest. These next ones here are terms that if you go through pages 18 through 818 to 820, you're going to see a lot of examples of these. These are all just stylistic choices that you can do in your poems. So dactyl, blank verse, pentameter, these are all just stylistic options you have as a poet. A villanelle is a country or folk song, and I really like that term, villanelle. I like that. And then we have popular ballads versus literary ballads. So I talked about that dwarf song from The Hobbit as it being an epic poem. It's also a literary ballad, so it's a song, the Misty Mountain song, but it's also has a fictional context within the story, so it has kind of like a prose quality to it. Whereas a popular ballad is just like a longer lyric. So Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin, that would be a popular ballad. Chapter 19 talks about persona, and we reviewed persona in the short story chapters. Persona being that voice that you adopt in a poem. So there's different types of personas that poets can kind of adapt to. One is a confessional persona, where it's sort of like a diary or secret type of voice. On page 853, actually, if you go to that page, we have Sappho's poem, A Letter to Anactoria. If you don't know who Sappho is, you should really look her up. She's basically the only female rhetorician from Greek times that is still recognized, and her poetry is really good. It's been translated. There's not a whole lot of it available, but I could talk all day about Sappho, or Sappho, however you want to say it. But her poem is on here from 6th century BC, which I think is cool. It's 500 years. It's basically almost 3,000 years ago. Isn't that crazy? Or 2,500 years ago, I guess. So it's pretty neat to see poetry translated from that long ago. But yeah, she adopts kind of a secretive persona here, like she's telling us a secret about like a secret love or a secret desire, and it's kind of cool. It's a cool voice to adopt. Other personas that poets can adopt to are sharing real life experiences, presenting a guarded or edited version of the subject matter, being a detached observer, so kind of like a fly on the wall, or even adopting the persona of an imaginary character, much like Dr. Seuss does. So the Lorax, for example, is an imaginary character persona that Dr. Seuss utilizes to convey his message throughout that poem. So there's just different options that you can do if you want to give a voice to your poem and its topic. Chapter 20 is the tone, which is our language of emotions. It's the attitude that we create throughout the poem. We've talked about understatement a bit, and page 880 talks about Dylan Thomas's Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, which is probably one of his most famous poems, if you want to look at it on page 880. Just this idea of playing down personal feelings, even though they're very, very intense. He's playing them down so that they have a stronger impact by the end. Elegies are poems of mourning, so they're kind of like tributes in a way. Elegies are just poems of mourning. A parable is a brief story with a weighty meaning. So our book is obsessed with Icarus. The story of Icarus is plastered all over this book. And you'll notice next couple of poems in this chapter are all really about Icarus. So if you don't know the story of Icarus, it's basically Icarus and his father, who's an inventor. His father creates him a set of wax wings, and that will let Icarus fly, and his father warns him, don't fly too close to the sun, your wings will melt and you'll die. And Icarus, who is very proud and arrogant, is like, nah, I'm fine. And he flies too close to the sun, the wings melt just like his father said they would, and he falls into the ocean and drowns. So the whole moral of the story is, one, take people's advice, especially if they're elder or experts and know more than you, and two, you don't be consumed, don't be arrogant, don't be too proud, because it'll end up being your downfall. But there's a lot of poems and stories in this textbook that deal with the tale of Icarus and it being retold in certain ways, and one of which would be a parable. Irony, again, our textbook finds another way to define this term. In this way, it's a wry, humorous effect brought about by presenting a truth we'd rather hide. That's how our textbook defines irony for this unit. I'm not crazy about the poetry definition of irony. I really like the one that was back in the short story section, but I wanted to bring it up here just to show you that our textbook is giving it another layer. And then paradox, you've probably heard of the term paradox before. That is a second contradiction or an apparent contradiction that makes sense the second time around. Not exactly the traditional definition of paradox, but that's how it's applied to poetry here. Theme is chapter 1, and our textbook talks about certain things with theme to note. One is being careful of abstractions, which are large, vague areas. Many poems fall into this abstraction theme because the poet is trying to be as vague as possible to let audiences get whatever meaning they want out of the poem, which is fine. It does frustrate a lot of people because they're like, no, I want to know what this poem's about. And the poet's like, I don't know, you'll figure it out. Didactic is teaching ideas or accepted truths or realities. And a caricature is a comic distortion or exaggeration of a theme or feeling or emotion. And then finally, chapter 22, we talk about mythos, myth and illusion. And mythos is the Greek word for tales or stories. Typically, poetry that is myth-based deals with Greek or Roman gods and goddesses, with monsters, with adversaries, with heroes like Hercules or Heracles, however you want to say it, and deals kind of like in a storytelling format. There's usually a ritual, which is an event acted out by the hero or celebrated champion, or an act of redemption. Archetypes are full on in force with a mythos. So the hero, the damsel in distress, the monstrous villain, they're all going to be in those poems at some point or another. An allusion is a brief mention that calls up a story, usually leads to a flashback. So if something alludes to something, that is an allusion. So if a character mentions a phrase that gets the other character to kind of start thinking about the past, that's an allusion. Not an illusion, an allusion. An ode is very similar to an elegy. It's just a solemn poem, not specifically for mourning, but just something solemn or serious. And then obviously a metamorphosis is a transformation. And there's a final set of glossy pages on page 954. And like I said, many stories about Icarus in this chapter. So yeah, that is our chapters here on poetry. Like I said, next week I'm going to be going over MLA. So the chapters for poetry there's a lot of chapters on poetry, but they're all not very long. They basically deal with just these terminologies that I've talked about in this presentation. So before we leave, I know I've made this video long, but I do want to talk about Paper 2's guidelines. All right, so Paper 2, I'll go ahead and tell you, is usually the paper that is the most challenging for students in terms of topic. It's not our longest paper at all, but it's one that is extremely creative and has some options, and it's probably the most different paper you'll ever write in a class. But we're going to stretch ourselves outside the box, and we're going to have fun with this, okay? So our theme is poetry. So you have 3 options of how you can do this paper. 2 options are very similar. Options 1 and option 3 are very similar, and we're going to talk about how they're different. And then option 2 is its own magical creation. So option 1, you get to choose 2 poems from either our textbook or an alternate source. That's up to you. If you have a book of poetry, maybe you want to use some poems from it. I don't know, totally fine. You are going to compare and contrast those 2 poems. Tell me how they are similar, how they're different, and analyze these poems using some of the terms we've just talked about in those presentations. So, how is the rhyme scheme? Is there an allusion in the poem? Is there meter, iambic pentameter? Give me some terms from our chapters to show me how these poems are created and show me how they're similar and different. And then at the very end of your paper, you are going to create for me a short poem. Yes, we are going to do some creative writing in here. You're going to create a very short poem. This can be 1 stanza, it can be half a page, it can be a couple stanzas, however crazy go nuts you want to go. But I want you to at least create for me a short poem that mirrors at least one of the poems that you review. So if you look at 2 Edgar Allan Poe poems and you're comparing and contrasting them, you want your short poem to resemble an Edgar Allan Poe poem itself. So you're going to be doing a little bit imitation with this assignment. You're going to be doing a little bit of imitation for the poem. All right. Option 2 is the one that's totally different. Option 2, you choose 2 photographs of your choosing, and then you create your own little poem for each of them. So you pick 2 of your photos, create 2 poems based on those photos, and then the rest of the paper is where you'll actually break down and explain your decisions and the terms that you used in each of the poems you created. So it's kind of like you're comparing and contrasting your own work. You're going to create 2 poems based on some images, and then you compare and contrast how they're similar and how they're different and which perhaps you like better. That one's all creative writing. I would recommend, if you choose option 2, to pick photographs that you own or that you took yourself. That way you don't have to use MLA citations. You don't have to cite your own work. So you don't have to cite your own photographs if you own them. All right. Now, if you go to Google Images and copy and paste some images from there, you need to cite them because you need to give credit where you found those images. All right. That's option 2. Option 3, like I said, is similar to option 1. Instead of 2 poems from the textbook, you're going to pick 2 songs because songs are lyrics, right? And you're going to explain how the 2 songs are similar and different in terms of their writing, in terms of their poetry. Which one's better? How does poetry transition to song? How does it transition to spoken word? How is it different? And then you will create at the very end your own song stanza or song verse that mimics the style of at least one of your artists that you picked. So I've had a lot of students choose any of these options and create a solid paper. It's really what you gravitate more towards. If you're a big music person, I definitely pick option 3. I think you're going to have more fun comparing and contrasting songs than you would anything else. If you're a creative writing person and you like writing poetry, I think option 2 would be fun. You can create your own poems and discuss how you made them and the choices you made and how they're similar and different from one another. And if you're a more traditionalist person that doesn't want to talk about music, that doesn't want to do creative writing, I would choose option 1. And that way you can choose 2 poems from a textbook or an alternate source and compare and contrast them. All right. As far as formatting goes, the page length, at least 2.5 pages for the content, and then the poem you create should be a solid verse or half a page in length. You can format the poem however you like, but the text itself in the analysis should be 12-point font, double-spaced, margins should be the same. So your analysis should be formatted the exact same way we formatted the last paper, but your poem, you can go crazy on that. You can do whatever you want on the poem in terms of stylistic design, fonts, etc. Grammar and spelling, I'm going to be looking at those. I do want you to cite your textbook. This is our first go around with MLA. I want at the end of your paper for the textbook to be cited, and I'm going to take points off if it's not. So you read it first, right here. Cite your textbook and any extra sources that you look up to help yourself. If you don't use any extra sources, you don't have to cite them, but you do at least have to cite your textbook. The works cited page should be on its own page, and in-text citations included in the analysis. And we'll talk about MLA next week, so you can kind of do your works cited page and your in-text citations sort of as an afterthought after you get started writing your paper. All components and drafts are due on time for full credit. The dates are listed in the guidelines, and then the points are going to be shown right here. So your introduction, conclusion, the elements described, creativity and effort, I get it. We are not all poets. This is not a creative writing class, so I'm not going to be like, you have to be the next Robert Frost in order to get an A. Not true. I just want to know that you've created a poem and you have shown effort. You've shown that you are abiding by the option listed above, whether it's to imitate an author, whether it's to create your own poem, whether it's to incorporate the elements that you say in your paper that you incorporated. I just want to know that you follow through with what you talk about in your paper. And if you do that and it shows creativity, I'm going to give you those 20 points. Don't worry. Grammar and spelling, page length and formatting. So if you just do the poems and you don't write an analysis, that's going to be 40 points lost. That's a D. So don't do that. I have had students just turn in 2 poems and they're like, okay, I'm done. I'm like, no, you got to analyze too. You got to break them down. So make sure to read those guidelines up there of what you've got to do. Okay. And if you have any questions, please let me know. But usually the thesis and the outline is where I can kind of pick apart if there's anything confusing or if there's any questions, I can kind of answer through that assignment. So just let me know. Paper 2, I think once you get started with it, will be quite easy. It's just figuring out what option you want to do and deciding which route you want to go. But as I've said, if you have questions, just let me know and I'll be happy to answer them. I hope you all have a great week. I am excited for paper number 2. I often find that the students have quite a bit of fun with this paper once you figure out what you're going to do for it. But just make sure that you view this video, that you have this video watched before you do the poetry exam next week, and that you let me know if you have any questions. All right? Have a great week, everybody, and I'll talk to you all soon. Bye.